They say the castle breathed differently in winter. The stones were colder, yes, and the tapestries hung heavier with the scent of wood smoke. But it wasn't just the air. It was the hush between footsteps, the way the corridors seemed to lean inward, listening, especially near the queen's quarters. Especially at night. It began with a door. A tall, carved thing at the far end of a velvet-draped hall, the queen's door. The one no one opened. The one that, some whispered, never fully closed. Even the servants stepped lighter in that wane. They said if you paused too long near that door, you'd feel it, a pull, like breath in reverse, as if something behind it inhaled your thoughts. And perhaps that wasn't far from the truth. The queen, whose name had slowly vanished from court records, like ink fading under too much sunlight, was once known for her beauty. Not the kind that bloomed in paintings or inspired sonnets. No, hers was the quiet kind, the unsettling kind, the kind that made you feel she knew something about you hadn't told anyone. She wore a mask, of course. Not always, not in youth, but after her marriage, after the fire, after the dreams began, then, yes, then she wore it every night. It was made of silver, hammered so thin you could almost see the pattern of her breath upon it. But never her face. They said it was to protect her skin, that the fire had scarred her, that the cold irritated her lungs, that the mask was blessed by a monk who cured sleepwalkers, that it was punishment, that it was armor. But those were stories told by people who never saw her. The guards who stood watch outside her chambers knew better. They said the queen never slept in a bed, that she lay upright in a wooden cradle lined with wool and herbs. Her hands folded, her breathing almost imperceptible, that some nights, she whispered answers to questions no one had asked, that the mask sometimes moved. Only one man ever entered that room and returned change. He was a painter, commissioned to capture her likeness for the Hall of Regents. He arrived with brushes and pigments, eyes bright with ambition. He left 3 days later with gray in his beard and silence in his mouth. When asked what he saw, he said, "She is not what she was, but she remembers." He never painted again, and so the door remained. It never locked, it never opened fully. It sat there at the end of the hall like a question left unanswered. But some nights, in the deep hush before dawn, you might hear it, a soft creak, a sigh, the faintest chime of silver. And if you stood very still, you might catch a glimpse through the crack of lamplight flickering against a pale oval, of a shadow that did not shift with the candle, and you would turn away, because the queen who slept in a mask did not like to be watched. And some say she never really slept at all. They say she waited, that the dreams she dreamed were not her own, but borrowed, that her silence was not sleep, but listening. To what? No one could say. But once, during a storm, a chambermaid claimed she heard a melody from inside, a lullaby. But reversed, the notes crawled backward, as if memory itself were unraveling. And when the lightning struck the western tower, the queen did not stir. Her mask glowed faintly, like moonlight trapped in metal. That night, the maid left her post and walked until her boots wore through. She never spoke of it again, and others soon learned not to ask. In time, people forgot the queen's name. Her portrait never arrived. Her bedchamber became a sealed room, and then a rumor, and then a pause in conversation. But the door, it remained, tall, slightly ajar, waiting. If you ever walk the old castle grounds, pause at the end of the velvet corridor, breathe in the hush, listen, and if the air shifts, if something unseen exhales beneath your skin, remember, not all who rest are sleeping. And not all silence is peace. It was said the queen never removed her mask after sundown, not even when illness threatened, not even when the summer heat made the stone walls sweat and the breath catch thick in the air. The mask remained, a second skin, a vow pressed into metal. The palace kept no official record of its origin, but the seamstresses whispered it had been forged in secret, far from the court, by a smith who used no fire. Only pressure, only silence. The mask, they said, bore no latch. It fastened like memory, tight and unyielding, but somehow seamless. Every morning, when the queen emerged for counsel, it was gone, and no one ever saw the moment it left her face. That space between mask and woman became a void where truth fell asleep. Those who entered her chamber found the air curiously dense. The incense burned slower, the candles wept wax in spirals. She would be seated in her tall back chair by the hearth, Already masked, already still, no one spoke unless spoken to. Even her maids communicated with gestures, a nod, a bow, the careful offering of warmed gloves or rosewater. She never responded to touch, but if your hand lingered too close, you might feel it, a hum, barely there, as though the mask itself breathed. Legends bloomed in the absence of answers. One courtier claimed the queen once muttered in her sleep, not words, but tones, notes so pure and low they made the mirror crack. A steward claimed the mask would sometimes fog over from the inside, though the queen remained perfectly still. A poet said he caught a glimpse through her window once and saw a flicker of movement behind the eyeholes. Not blinking, not watching, just remembering. But the most enduring tale came from the royal dreamkeeper, a post that existed nowhere else in Europe. He was not a doctor, nor priest, nor tutor. His sole duty was to listen to the queen recount her dreams every morning, and write them down, in ink made of crushed petals and sea salt, on paper so thin it shivered when touched. The scrolls were locked in a brass coffer beneath the east tower, never to be read aloud. Only one was ever discovered, torn, scorched at the edge, and it read, "I stood in the garden of faces. None were mine, I wore their grief like gloves." And still, the bell rang. Some say the queen dreamed the memories of others, that the mask collected them as she slept, that it was less a garment and more a vessel, that each breath she took filtered sorrow from the world around her. Not to destroy it, but to carry it. The mask itself was delicate, but not fragile, silver overlaid with woven threads of midnight blue. The edges bore runic stitching that changed shape in torchlight. When polished, it showed no reflection, only depth, as if your face might fall into it and vanish. A visiting scholar once requested to examine it. He was permitted entry. He emerged with trembling hands and a voice that stuttered syllables no one could understand. He died a year later, whispering, "She holds the echo." The queen never acknowledged the stories. She never explained the mask, or why her dreams mattered more than decrees. But she ruled with unshakable calm. Disasters were avoided, treaties honored, storms predicted before their arrival. And each morning, a dream recorded. Some nights, the villagers claimed they heard soft notes drifting down from the palace windows. A melody no one recognized, but all remembered, the kind of tune that made you homesick for a place you never lived. And within the chamber, behind that silver veil, the queen sat unmoving, not asleep, not fully awake, suspended between breath and echo. In every court, there are whispers, not the ones spoken boldly over wine or scribbled into letters sealed with too much wax. The quiet ones, the ones you catch only when the hallways are empty and the fire has sunk low. About her, always about her, they moved through the walls like perfume from an unopened vial, sweet, cloying, impossible to name, and they always began the same way. "Did you hear what she did last night?" They said the queen never cried, that her tears had stopped the moment she first wore the mask. And yet, her pillows were replaced every week, stained faintly with something that shimmered in the morning light, not quite water, not quite salt, as if even her sorrow had been transformed. The laundresses, sworn to silence, sometimes paused before washing them. One said the stains gave off a scent like lavender drowned in ink. No one dared ask her why she wore it, but everyone guessed. That was the game. Behind closed doors, courtiers invented reasons. Her beauty was too terrible to behold, her skin too sacred, her breath laced with prophecy. Or, the favorite among the younger pages, that she no longer had a face at all, that the mask had become her. Some swore the mask shifted slightly when the queen tilted her head, as if it followed the listener's thoughts. The queen never corrected them. At dinners, she sat at the head of the long, polished table, the mask catching firelight and turning it into shadow. She rarely spoke, but when she did, her voice slipped through the silver like honey wrapped in snow. And each time, the room quieted as if the chandeliers themselves were holding their breath. Musicians played softer, forks halted midair, and even the courtiers known for irreverent smirks folded their hands without knowing why. When she left, she moved without sound. Her footsteps never echoed. Her scent was always lavender and iron. She would vanish behind her velvet door, and the stories would begin again. The pages who held the door open for her described a sudden drop in temperature, like the end of a prayer. One claimed he once saw the edge of her gown move before she did. as if time paused to make way. Even the palace dogs refused to bark near her chamber. One barked once, and was never seen again. There was one tradition, however, that the queen observed without fail. Every new moon, when the sky turned blank and the stars hung low, she would walk the length of the eastern gallery alone. She carried a single candle in a glass holder, not for light, but for weight, something to tether her steps. Each month, the same path, and each time, she stopped at the final window, the one that overlooked the rose courtyard. Long since overgrown, the wax never melted, the glass never smudged, the candle was an anchor, not a flame. There, she would pause, just long enough to breathe, and then, she would whisper. No one ever heard what she said, but those stationed nearby spoke of a stillness that followed, a kind of hush that made your pulse slow, as if time stepped back for a moment, as if the stones remembered her. Some said the whisper lingered, curling around the arches like incense, reaching ears not meant to hear. The marble floor beneath her always held warmth the next day. She returned the same way, candle unburnt, dress uncreased, mask slightly cooler to the touch. Her hair never disheveled, not a fold out of place. The palace seamstresses suspected magic but never spoke of it aloud. The gods began to call it the reverence. Some believed she spoke to a ghost. Others said she was reliving something, a moment only the moon remembered. Or perhaps the mask was hungry, and she was feeding it dreams. One archivist suggested that the mask contained a spell that required renewal each lunar cycle. An enchantment cast in silver and sleep. The chambermaids noticed small things. On the nights of her walks, the queen's room felt warmer. The flowers in the vases wilted faster. One claimed she found a pearl under the pillow the next morning, a perfect sphere with a crack like a whisper. Another once uncovered a faint imprint of a second head resting beside the queen's on the pillow, though no one had entered or left the chamber. But none of these fragments made sense alone. They were pieces of a woman stretched across shadow and silence, a queen wrapped not only in power, but in pattern. And what is a ritual, if not a truth too fragile to say aloud? A thread stitched again and again until it becomes indistinguishable from the cloth. She was a tapestry, living, breathing, remembering. Some years later, a visiting philosopher was invited to observe the queen's household as part of a diplomatic exchange. He kept a diary, long, thoughtful entries filled with reflections on architecture, etiquette, the politics of posture. But one page, only one, mentioned her. It read, "At dusk, the mask turned. I cannot say how, but it turned, not her head, just the mask, toward me, as if it heard my name from a distance I had forgotten." I bowed and left. I did not look back. He never returned to court, nor did he speak of his visit again. His final essay before his disappearance was titled, "On Faces That Remember." The queen continued, as she always had, still, silent, unchanging, until one evening, the walk did not happen. The candle remained cold, the eastern gallery untouched, and the pillow, when change, bore no shimmer. The flowers in her chamber stood tall the next morning, untouched by wilt. The pearl beneath the pillow had vanished. The silence that had once comforted now pressed against the walls like something unsaid. The next day, it rained, soft, reluctant, as if the sky had learned her rhythm. The clouds did not roll. They lingered, as if they, too, waited. And deep in the gallery, beneath the last window, a single rose bloomed, pale as bone. Its petals bore veins shaped like script, a script no one recognized. Yet everyone understood. It read nothing, and everything. It was never written into law, but everyone knew. The queen's dreams mattered more than any decree. While other monarchs held councils at dawn and signed parchments by candlelight, she began each day with silence, then with memory. No one was permitted to speak to her until she had sat for precisely 1 hour by the dream window, an arched slit of stone facing the eastern fog, where a single chair waited, carved with 7-petaled flowers. There, she would reflect, and when the hour passed, she would speak, but never of what she saw, only what must now be done. She once halted a war because, as she told her advisers, the river had no name last night. That was all. No elaboration, no context. The troops were pulled back. A treaty was signed. The harvests that year were unusually kind. Another time, she ordered all clocks in the southern wing of the palace removed and buried under the orchard. The very next week, lightning struck the belfry twice. Not a single servant was harmed, because none had lingered. They no longer trusted the rhythm of time. They followed hers instead. The queen's chamber, where the dreams arrived, was more sanctum than bedchamber. No paintings adorned the walls. Only layers of deep velvet and stone worn smooth with quiet. The bed itself was narrow, like a monk's cot, but covered in layered linens of midnight blue. Above it, a canopy of sheer silk drifted faintly even when there was no breeze. The room had no clock, no mirror, no writing desk. The only object of note, aside from the mask she wore, was a single glass bell on the table beside her pillow. It had no clapper, it did not ring, but each morning, it changed hue, silver when she slept soundly, amber when disturbed, deep violet when her dreams had turned to omens. The dream keeper, a woman named Mayal, had served 3 generations of monarchs in quiet obscurity until the queen summoned her. She spoke rarely, and never directly to the queen. Instead, she listened, she recorded, she wrote in a script only she could read, on vellum so fine it curled under breath. Each morning, she transcribed the queen's murmurings into scrolls and sealed them with blue wax. No one else was permitted to see them. The crown, heavy with rubies and regret, sat untouched most of the year. It was only worn for ceremony. And even then, only after a dream had approved the day. There was one occasion, a festival of stars, when a particularly vivid dream led the queen to walk barefoot among her subjects. She did not speak, but children wept upon seeing her. One reached up and touched the edge of her gown, and afterward, his fever broke. He lived to be 90, and when asked about that day, he would say only, "She carried the night inside her, and gave it to the sky." The court slowly adjusted to this new rhythm. Ministers learned to interpret gestures more than words. If the queen placed her hand on her mask after sitting, they knew to delay decisions. If she turned her gaze toward the southern window, it meant the matter had already passed. But if she closed her eyes mid-meeting, they paused, waited, and did not breathe until she opened them again. Dreams became policy. One advisor once tried to question her. He demanded to know what right a dream had to overrule parliament. The queen said nothing. She merely rose, crossed the chamber, and opened the eastern window. Fog swept in, and with it, the sound of a bell, not from the palace, but from the lake beyond. A bell no one had rung in years. The advisor resigned that evening. Some say he left the country. Others claim he became a monk. Over time, people brought her their dreams. Villagers came with scraps of parchment, children's drawings, bundles of herbs tied with ribbons. They believed she could interpret them, though she never offered explanations. Instead, she would look once, nod, and hand the item to Mayal. It would be stored, catalogued, and kept in the dream vault beneath the palace floor. The vault was never opened, but they say it hummed at night. Rumors grew that her dreams were not just visions, but maps, that they could predict floods, deaths, pregnancies, wars, that she had once dreamed of a forest fire 3 kingdoms away and sent aid before the flames ever touched bark. That her dreams were not hers at all, but borrowed, snatched from the minds of others as they slept. Carried across wind and star, and always, she returned to the dream window. Every morning, without fail, some began to call her the Oracle Queen. Others, the Crown of Sleep. The neighboring king, in a letter to his ambassador, referred to her as that sovereign of the second sight. But not all were pleased. A group of scholars petitioned to study her sleep patterns. They believed her dreams could be explained. Neurology, trauma, repetition. They were denied. One of them, in defiance, tried to replicate the mask, hoping to induce similar visions. He fell into a month-long coma and awoke speaking in a language no one could place. He lives now by the sea and refuses to enter buildings with windows. Even so, the queen never sought to be worshipped. She never claimed divinity. She simply listened. She dreamed, and in dreaming, she guided. And when she died, if she died at all, for no body was ever seen, the glass bell beside her bed turned completely black. Mayal wrote one final scroll. It contained a single phrase. The night has turned its face. And that morning, for the first time in memory, no one dreamed. It was not forged in a royal smithy, nor touched by any coronation rite. The mask did not come from crowns or creeds, but from silence and from hands no longer remembered. There were no records of its making, only of its arrival. Wrapped in violet silk, placed quietly on a stone pedestal beneath the altar of the chapel that no one visited. When the queen first found it, she did not flinch, she only stared, as if recognizing something she had not yet lived. For hours, she sat before it. The mask did nothing, but something else did. The air, perhaps, or the dust on the sill that refused to settle, or the sound, barely a note, like breath caught between two centuries. The mask was simple in form but unbearable in feeling. Bronze, but not cold, lined with faint lines that shimmered when seen from the side. At the temples, a pair of tiny etchings, one a rose, the other a lock. Its eyes were not hollowed but curved slightly inward, as if to catch more than they revealed. The lips were closed, but not sealed, and the expression was none, not blank, not still, just waiting. On the seventh day, the queen placed it in her lap, then against her cheek, and when she pressed it to her face, it did not fall, it clung, not by force, but by agreement, like two halves that once knew the same silence. No proclamation was made, no decree, but the next morning, the court found her seated at the high table, already masked, and though her attire was unchanged, something had shifted. The air around her was slower, heavier, as if meaning had taken up residence. The mask was not an adornment, it was a boundary. From that day, she no longer wore jewels, no longer accepted painted portraits. Her reflection was covered in all mirrors. Even fountains were drained near her garden. The mask had become her face, and in so doing, made the rest of the world uncertain. For who are we, when we no longer recognize what we expect? There were whispers, of course, that the mask had fused to her skin, that beneath it, her face had vanished, that it was no longer she who wore it, but the mask that wore her. And yet, no one left, no minister resigned, no subject revolted, because despite the silence, the kingdom thrived, trade flourished, border disputes vanished, weather, though still temperamental, grew less cruel, as if the land itself recognized a new rhythm. Once each year, during the winter solstice, she would sit alone in the nave of the ruined chapel, where the mask had been waiting for her once. She did not speak, nor pray, she only sat, as the wind curled through the broken windows, pulling the scent of ash and frost into the room. The candles lit themselves, or so the guards claimed, and once, just once, a monk swore he saw the mask cry. No tear, just condensation, forming where breath might have lingered. In the private chambers, another story unfolded. The queen began to write, not in letters, not in books, but on the inner walls of her rooms. Thin chalk lines, symbols no one could translate. Each morning, the servants found the patterns rearranged, as if rewritten in sleep. They dusted the walls clean as instructed, but some began copying them in secret. And later, when scholars from the East arrived, they recognized fragments of those symbols in lost scrolls, once thought destroyed in the burning of the ivory library. They called it the silent script, and they said it did not describe actions, but emotions, not declarations, but thresholds, as if the queen was charting the inner shifts of being itself. One night, her lady-in-waiting heard humming, low, slow, like a melody made by breath alone. She approached the queen's chamber and paused. The door was ajar. Inside, the queen sat before the mirror, not to see, but to remember, and there, on the mask, a crack had begun to form, not jagged, not violent, but deliberate, a fissure just above the left brow. Like a question, that same night, the dreams returned, not to her, but to the court. Pages whispered of strange sleep. Ministers grew pale and forgetful. One knight collapsed during his watch, muttering about eyes behind the sky, and in the kitchens, the bread rose too quickly, then fell flat before dawn. The mask was no longer only hers, but she did not remove it. Instead, she began a ritual. Each night, she lit a candle, not for light, but for passage. She walked the halls in silence, pausing at doorways, bowing to statues, touching stone with gloved hands. The path varied, but each night ended in the same place, the gallery of tapestries. And before one, a woven image of a queen with no face, seated beneath a black tree, stars falling into her lap. That tapestry had no name, until the queen named it in chalk. And that name, when translated, meant the memory that chose to stay. When she returned to her chamber, The mask always seemed lighter, and though it never left her face, it began to respond, to light, to voices, to seasons. In spring, it glowed faintly. In summer, it grew warm to touch. In autumn, it darkened around the edges. And in winter, it sang. Not aloud, but in silence. The kind of silence that bends time, that slows breath, that invites the forgotten to return. They say a prince once tried to replicate it, commissioned 5 artisans to forge him a similar mask. All failed. One went blind, another fled into the woods. The rest refused to speak of it again. Whatever the queen wore, it was not metal alone. It was memory, bound in form. And what is a memory, if not the part of us we cannot leave behind? So the queen wore it still. And beneath the crown, beneath the silken vow, beneath the ache of centuries, she listened, and the mask, in its silence, listened back. They began draping the halls in black before the queen had spoken a word. Not by command, but by instinct, as if the walls themselves remembered a loss not yet named. Velvet hung from every archway, soaking in the morning light like silence made fabric. The bells, once rung for the turning of seasons, were muffled, and the gardens, once vibrant with winter berries, grew still, each stem bowing faintly as if in prayer. Grief, it seemed, had entered not as a storm, but as mist, unseen, unstoppable. And yet, no one had died, not officially. There were no funerals, no caskets, no sobbing in chapel pews. What there was absence, a presence removed, a warmth that no longer stirred the corridors. The queen remained in her quarters, the mask still on, but she no longer walked the candlelit halls, no longer traced symbols on stone. Her silence had changed timbre, less like contemplation, more like ache. Some said she was mourning something yet to happen. Others whispered she had already seen it, in dream or omen, and was mourning what the rest had not yet caught up to. The mourning spread slowly. First, the scribes began writing more softly, their quills barely whispering against parchment. Then, the cooks stopped seasoning meals altogether, claiming every spice felt too loud. In the village below, a musician laid down his flute and refused to play, saying every note felt like it might break something. A shepherd claimed his sheep no longer followed him, they just stood still, staring toward the castle with eyes too knowing. By the 3rd week, people forgot laughter, not because joy was banned, but because joy had nowhere to land. It hovered, untethered, unsure. In her chamber, the queen did not weep, not in the way mortals weep, but something in her posture sagged, the tilt of her shoulders, the way she sat for hours with her gloved hand resting on her knee, not idle, but intentional, as though holding something heavy that no one else could see. And all the while, the mask remained, only now, faint streaks of tarnish traced along the jawline, not from age, but from memory. Memory, after all, wears down more than time ever could. One night, the chambermaid entered to stoke the fire. She found the queen sitting in front of an empty chair. A second chair, a chair no one remembered being brought in. Upon it, a single velvet ribbon, tied in a knot, no crest, no embroidery, just velvet, fraying slightly at the ends. The queen, still masked, reached out and placed the ribbon gently in a wooden box beside her. The box was then sealed, and never opened again. The next morning, the sky refused to brighten, though the sun had risen. The clouds held it back, folding the day in layers of gray. Doves did not fly. The tower bells, muffled though they were, shuddered in their ropes as if uneasy. The morning had deepened, and yet, still, no name was spoken. The archivist, curious and aching, began looking through records, not of death, but of disappearance. He found notes, loosely connected. A gardener who vanished after claiming to have heard humming beneath the ground. A knight who spoke of dreams full of soft bells, then rode east and never returned. A child who stared at the queen's mask and whispered, "That's not her anymore," before refusing to speak again. What was mourned, it seemed, was not one loss, but many small vanishings. Layers peeled away from the world, slowly enough not to alarm, but deeply enough to hollow. And through it all, the queen sat. She did not speak, but one morning, the velvet was gone, not torn down, not removed, simply vanished. In its place, pale ribbons of linen tied to each column. Linen the color of early frost, and the court understood, without instruction, That morning had passed into something else. Not healing, not peace, but clarity. That afternoon, the queen returned to the chapel. For the first time in months, she walked alone, cloak brushing lightly against the cobbled stones. No guards, no entourage, only the sound of her boots. Quiet and certain, inside the chapel, winter light filtered through broken stained glass. And there, at the altar, she placed the sealed wooden box. She did not open it, only rested her hands atop it, closed her eyes, and bowed her head. The mask shimmered faintly, like a side turned visible. The villagers later said the air shifted that day. The wind blew warmer, the snow softened underfoot, and for the first time in a season, someone whistled while gathering wood. It wasn't joy, but it was the memory of joy. And that was enough. That evening, a parchment appeared on the queen's writing desk. No one saw who placed it there. It was blank, save for one line written in gold ink. Mourning is not for the dead, it is for what lives. Unseen, the queen read it once, then folded it, placed it in her sleeve, and turned toward the window. Her reflection stared back at her, not just the mask, but the presence behind it. And for the first time, she nodded, not to herself, but to the one still missing. Outside, a single snowflake touched the sill and did not melt. The archives beneath the eastern wing of the castle were not meant to be visited after sundown. Not by rule, but by rhythm. Even the rats knew to keep quiet there once dusk settled, as if some unspoken agreement had been struck with the stones. The place was not dangerous, no curses carved into pillars, no skeletons chained to walls, but it was watchful, a stillness that did not invite but tolerated your presence, a hush older than silence. And yet, the archivist remained. His candle flickered faintly atop the desk, melding low into the base of a brass holder shaped like a lion's mouth. Behind him, shelves stretched deep into shadow, packed with scrolls too brittle to touch and ledgers bound in leather that no longer creaked. The air smelled of ink and age and something faintly sweet, like burnt lavender. He moved slowly, not from weakness, but reverence. His fingers touched each document like a blessing. He did not read for knowledge. He read for remembering. Tonight, however, he was not reading. He was waiting. On the table lay a book that had not been opened in over a century. Its title had long faded from the spine, but someone had marked the edge with a red thread, neatly tucked, as if to say, "This page matters." The archivist did not open it. Not yet. He waited for the candle to reach a certain height, the midpoint between wick and holder. The exact moment when shadow overtakes flame. Only then did he breathe deeply and lift the cover. The page was blank, but only at first. As the candlelight pooled, faint ink rose like mist from the fibers. Words in looping script unfurled themselves, line by line, as if shy of being seen. He did not speak them aloud. He simply read, and the deeper he read, the stiller he became, until his hands stopped moving, and his breath stilled entirely. It was not a story. It was a confession. Not his, not anyone's living, but hers, the queen's, the queen who wore a mask not out of vanity or illness, but as penance, not for something she had done, but for something she had failed to do. The ink traced memories too fragmented to be called truth, and too vivid to be dismissed, of a bell cast in secrecy, of voices hidden in tone, of a crown that hummed at night when placed beside the bell, of a dream that would not let go. The archivist did not flinch, did not cry. He only leaned closer. His candle guttered once, and he adjusted the holder slightly, placing a small mirror beside it so the light would double, not brighten, but endure. That was his gift, his role, not to illuminate the world, but to keep one light from dying. Behind him, a whisper moved through the archives. No footsteps, just breath. He did not turn, but his eyes softened. He knew the queen had arrived. She said nothing, but her hand reached forward, gloved, and rested gently on the opposite side of the book. For a moment, they did not read, they simply existed, together, across a page soaked in memory. Then she spoke. "Do you believe it's still buried?" The archivist paused. "I believe memory doesn't sink. It waits." She nodded, as if expecting that answer, then slid a folded piece of parchment toward him. On it, a sketch, a bell, half sunken in ice, lines radiating from its center, not like sound, but like cracks, along the rim, in tiny script. The same line that had once appeared on a writing desk. Mourning is not for the dead, it is for what lives. Unseen, the archivist touched the sketch, then closed the book slowly. And stood, he walked toward the furthest corner of the archive, past records of taxes, treaties, wars long unspoken, and reached behind a loose brick. From it, he pulled a candle, thicker than most, black wax, flecked with something silver, not glitter, not dust, something older, something alchemical. He handed it to her. This candle does not burn for light, he said, it burns for truth, only in the right place, only at the right hour. The queen took it silently, then turned to leave. As she reached the steps, the archivist called out, his voice softer than usual, but somehow louder than stone. Will you take a guide? She paused, then turned, and for the first time, removed one glove, not the mask, but the glove. Her fingers were pale, but warm. She extended her hand, and he, old and fragile and made of ink and time, took it. They climbed together, past the shelves, past the ghosts, past the dust. When they reached the door, the queen did not open it. She whispered dead, and it opened. Snow had returned to the lake that week, not in storms, but in soft, silken hushes, as if the sky no longer meant to frighten, only to fold the world in silence. The trees held their breath again, and the wind forgot its name. You came back not with questions now, but with an ache, a weight that wasn't yours and yet pressed upon your chest like inherited grief. There, in the same place where dreams once pulled you across frozen water, you stood again, lantern in hand, its warm circle of light trembling across the white. The lake was smoother now, the ice thick as bone and just as pale, but in the center, something new, faint, round, dark, almost imperceptible beneath the surface. A distortion, perhaps, a memory trying to show its shape. You stepped carefully across the ice, each footfall whispering more than it sounded. And with every step, the chill rose higher through your boots, your legs, your spine, but you didn't stop, not when you saw the edge of a bell. It wasn't whole, not entirely, but it was there, just beneath the ice like a fossil of sound. A mouth wide open, yet sealed by centuries of cold. Cracks laced across its surface like veins of regret, and within them glowed something faint, not fire, not light, a shimmer, like breath trapped too long. You knelt, fingertips brushing the glassy surface above it. The world seemed to tilt inward, drawing everything, wind, light, thought, into this one still point, and beneath your palm, not heat, but vibration, so small, so steady, as though the bell had never stopped ringing, only lowered its voice until only the lake could hear. You didn't cry, you didn't speak, you simply stayed, until you felt her, not as a figure, not as a voice, but as a presence, ancient, patient, watching, a warmth that filled the cold without melting it, a sorrow that never demanded pity. And in that stillness, she offered a sound, not a note, not a chime, but a memory, a moment long forgotten. It was a coronation, not of a king, but of silence. The bell rang in a distant past when no one celebrated, no one cheered. It was for a queen whose name had been scrubbed from stone. A queen who wore a mask not for pride or ritual, but because her dreams betrayed her face, because what she saw in sleep would terrify the living. The bell was made to hold her burden, to sing what she could not say. And when she passed, it did not toll in mourning, it exhaled, one long, soft tone that rolled across the hills like mist. And in its wake, people forgot just enough to survive. And now, it waited. You pressed both palms against the ice. There was no ritual, no incantation, just presence. Then the ice cracked, not loud, not shattering, but sighing. A line drew itself slowly from the bell outward, as if the lake, too, was remembering, as if it, too, had dreamt of her, and you, merely a breath in that dream, were chosen to stand at its center. From the woods, the wolves did not howl. From the village, no light flickered. The world had bent toward this moment with quiet reverence. And as the crag beneath you deepened, a chime, not metal, not air, rose, not into your ears, but into your blood, a sound shaped like a question and an answer at once. And for the first time, you understood why she wore the mask. It wasn't to hide, it was to hold, to protect a truth so delicate, so heavy, that the bell had to be made to bear its echo. Because the world was never cruel enough to silence her. only afraid to remember her completely. You stood slowly. The crack had stopped. The bell rested still, half exposed now. It shimmered like an idea. And beside it, just faintly beneath the surface, another shape, a hand, or perhaps only a shadow of one. You turned away gently, not with fear, but with the kind of reverence you reserve for graves and lullabies. Back on shore, you didn't look back. The wind stirred again, this time not cold, but expectant. You would return, but not to find answers. To remember. The path back to the village was not the same, or perhaps it was, but you had changed. The snow no longer seemed as deep, the sky no longer as distant, and though your steps left no trail behind you, as if the lake itself had chosen to keep the secret, you carried something now. Not the bell, not the charm, but a silence that rang truer than any chime, and it guided you, as gently as breath over candlelight, toward the only place left, the library beneath St. Eloy. It was late when you arrived, the kind of late that seeps not just into clocks but into walls, into wood, into the fibers of paper that have been waiting too long to be read. The hospice where Sister Aurelie had lived stood dark, save for one flickering lamp in the corner window. You did not knock, you didn't need to. She was waiting. She stood in the hall, robes layered in thick wool, her eyes clearer than you remembered. In her hand, she held a bundle, linen, wrapped in careful folds. Without a word, she placed it into your arms. Inside, parchment, not dozens, just 3, but they were unlike anything you had seen in the archives. No dates, no scribe's mark, only symbols, carefully drawn concentric circles, overlapping as if to suggest echoes rather than diagrams. One sheet bore the faded outline of a woman's face, and across it, a mask, but not tied by ribbons, fused, like something the skin itself had formed. She was a dreamkeeper, Aurelie said, finally breaking the hush between you. They called her the last listener, but it was never about prophecy. It was preservation. Her mind held too much, so they split it into sound. You traced one of the circles with your fingertip. The bell. She wasn't bound to the bell. Aurelie whispered. The bell was bound to her. Then she looked away, as if listening to something outside the walls. They once believed that memory could be stored, not in ink, not in story, but in tone, that if you cast a vessel in grief, fed it with offerings of sorrow, it would hold what the heart could not. A chill moved through the room, not cold, but ancient, the kind that comes when something buried begins to stir. You opened the second parchment. It held no image, only lines of sound drawn like music, but unreadable. They undulated across the page, sharp peaks and narrow valleys, like breath and silence laid end to end. In the center, a tiny script, only what grieves can echo. You looked up. Did they really believe sound could remember? Aurelie did not answer. Instead, she led you through the hospice's narrow halls, down a stairwell of uneven stone, until the air thickened with age. The door she opened was small, iron-bound. Inside, the walls were lined not with books but with bells. Dozens, each no larger than a fist, each hanging from wooden pegs, wrapped in cloth, sealed with wax. The room sang without singing, a pressure against your ears, like standing inside a hush that had waited centuries. They're not bells in the way you think, Aurelie said. They're bindings, fragments. Each one holds a sliver of what she left behind. You walked slowly between them, feeling not fear but recognition, as if each bell mirrored a part of yourself you'd long forgotten. Regret, longing, stillness, each had its note, though none rang aloud. She wore the mask because her face had become too many stories. Aurelie said behind you, the crown was not a symbol of rule. It was a seal. You turned. A seal. She wasn't a queen of land or title. She ruled over memory, over what the world refused to keep. You looked down at your hands, at the third parchment still unopened. Your fingers hesitated. You can open it, Aurelie said, but know this. Once you do, the sound inside it becomes yours. You unfolded the final sheet. No symbols, just a single word written in faded ink. Return. And in that moment, everything, the lake, the bell, the dream, the silence, folded inward. Not gone, not erased, just remembered. The bells on the wall did not move, but one of them, just one, quivered slightly in its thread, as if hearing a name spoken from very far away. You would not take it. Not yet, but you would return, because some stories are not told. They're carried, and as you stepped away, your eyes caught a faint inscription above the door, worn nearly to illegibility. Echo is the name memory takes when it no longer needs a voice. The words hummed in your bones. You realized then that your journey was no longer about finding the bell, but about becoming its keeper. Not as a relic, but as a witness, a vessel for what refuses to be forgotten. As you climbed the stairs back toward the surface, each step echoed not in stone, but in something softer, deeper, as if the walls themselves were taking note. You emerged not with answers, but with resonance, with the quiet knowledge that memory was not a burden, but a duty, that what had once been sealed beneath ice now moved again, not in sound but in you. You did not return the next day, or the day after. Some paths are not walked twice by haste, but by the slow turning of quiet conviction. So it was weeks before you returned to the lake, and when you did, the world had changed. Winter had softened, the ice no longer creaked with warning but shimmered like tempered glass. Trees, once brittle with frost, now bore their first moss, and in the air, the hush had shifted, not absent, but listening. You came alone. There was no ceremony, no audience, just the faint sound of meltwater beneath the frozen skin of the lake and the memory of a name you had never spoken aloud, but which now pressed itself against your chest like breath held too long. The parchment had dissolved the night you left, not burned, not torn, just gone, as if it had fulfilled its task. You stepped onto the ice. There was no fear in your step, only familiarity, as if the lake had always waited, as if the shape of your footfall had been part of its design. At the center, where the lines of dream and daylight grew thin, you knelt, not to pray, but to remember. You did not bring tools. You did not bring offerings. You brought memory, grief shaped in silence, joy shaped in longing, questions never asked aloud. The ice responded not with sound, but with tension, a pressure just beneath the surface, like a held note waiting for release. And then you heard it. Not a chime, not a ring, a sigh, soft, full, a sound no bell should make, and yet entirely hers. It came not from beneath, but from within you, as if something remembered itself through your breath. The lake quivered, a fine line spread across the surface, not cracking, but unfolding. And then, the light. Not moonlight, not firelight, something older. It did not shine, it revealed. The ice became glass. Beneath it, shadows moved, figures, walking in circles, heads bowed, a ritual older than the abbey, older than the name of the village. And in the center, the bell. Lysarane, whole, not rusted, not broken. She gleamed not with metal, but memory. Her surface rippled, not with heat, but with stories. Your own reflection stared back from her curve, and it was not your face you saw. She rang. No hand touched her, no rope pulled, and yet, she rang, a sound shaped like release, like forgiveness, like the name of someone you once loved and never dared to mourn. It swept through you, not as sound, but as sensation, sudden warmth behind the eyes, breath caught then freed, and far away, though you could not see it, others stirred. A bell no larger than a coin trembled on a monastery wall. Another, buried in cathedral ruins, blinked once against its wax seal. A third, hidden beneath a hearth in a home no longer remembered, cracked its silence like an old joint in winter. They were waking, the bells, all of them, and when Lysarane rang again, they did not echo her. They answered, not in harmony, but in memory, each chime a voice once carried, once lost, now returned, names, places, moments, the time a child first spoke, the last glance of a soldier before dawn, the prayer a mother whispered without knowing it would be her last. None loud, none perfect, but together, complete. The lake did not break. It breathed, and you knew then, without proof, without doctrine, without witness, that this was never about a bell, or a queen, or even memory. It was about return. About the way silence holds a place for those willing to listen. About how the world does not forget, it waits. And when all bells ring, it is not the sound that matters. It is the remembering. You stood, not to leave, but to walk forward, toward the center, toward the light, toward the bell. Your foot touched the glass and passed through. There was no cold, no resistance, just memory, waiting to be carried. And you did not return to the village, because the story was not ending. It was beginning, and somewhere, in the hills, in the hearts, in the walls of forgotten places, The bells continued to stir, not to be found, but to be remembered.